Masks everywhere. All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to those of you who are here in person and to those of you who are joining us virtually. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Eric Maskin, the Adams University professor and professor of economics and mathematics at Harvard. Dr. Maskin has made significant contributions to game theory, contract theory, social choice theory, political economy, and other areas of economics. He is a winner of the 2007 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for having laid the foundations of mechanism design. Dr. Maskin received his AB and PhD from Harvard and was a postdoctoral fellow at Jesus College, Cambridge University. He was a faculty member at MIT from 1977 to 1984, Harvard from 1985 to 2000, and at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey from 2000 to 2011. He rejoined the Harvard faculty in 2012. Among his many academic interests, Dr. Maskin explores applications of economic theory that are used to solve a wide range of global challenges, interrogating the ethical implications of economics, not just in areas that concern financial markets or business growth. His work aligns closely with our own economics department here at Holy Cross and the mission of the McFarland Center, as both explore how ethics and religion impact economics and other areas of importance to society. The economic application that Dr. Maskin will discuss tonight is voting. A foundational element of our democracy, voting should be simple, correct? Well, not exactly. Dr. Maskin has written, "The most widely used method in the US currently is the plurality rule. Each voter votes for one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. However, if there are several candidates running, the winner, under the plurality rule, may get only 20% of the vote or even less. That is to say, a big majority of voters prefer someone else. So in many parts of the country, there are efforts underway to replace the plurality rule, and the question is, what should we replace it with? And that's where ethics come in. Efforts to change the way Americans vote, either by replacing the plurality rule or implementing another option that runs counter to ethical standards, is an issue that's ripped from our headlines. Just last week, the Supreme Court ruled on a redistricting case in Alabama, choosing to return to a congressional map that concentrates black voters in one district. Because states can also choose what system they use to vote, it's critical that they choose a system that will elect candidates ethically as per the will of the people. How can we improve our voting system and strengthen our democracy? What is our obligation as citizens and as people for others to ensure that any changes to our voting systems protect the rights of all? And how does economic theory influence the processes by which we vote? Our conversation this evening promises to be enlightening and educational, and we are grateful for the generous support of the Ream Foundation in bringing Dr. Maskin to campus. And finally, on a personal note, I'm honored to call Dr. Maskin, Eric, my friend, and we are delighted to welcome him to Holy Cross. Eric.
Well, thanks so much, Vince, and thanks to all of you for coming today. This is the second time I've been to Holy Cross in the last 6 months because I was out here for Vince's inaugural weekend last fall, which was a great pleasure. As he mentioned, we're personal friends, and so this was a special occasion for me. Very nice to be with you today. Well, as Vince said, and as the title indicates, we're going to talk today about how to improve presidential elections. I'll focus on presidential elections, but actually what I say will apply to almost any kind of political election. I think you'll agree that there's lots of room for improvement. Now, I know there's a discussion period at the end, but I'd like to invite you to ask clarifying questions at any time, because I'm going to be giving an argument which builds sequentially, and if you lose one of the steps along the way, what follows may not make much sense. So please feel free at any point to ask a clarifying question. Let me begin with a historical observation. Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, and I imagine that this observation is familiar to most of you. We might ask, how could this have happened? And I'm sure that for years to come, scholars in many fields will be trying to answer that question. Not only economists, but political scientists, sociologists, philosophers, and probably many others as well. I'm going to try to answer that question in a fairly narrow way. Donald Trump got to be president because first he got the Republican nomination, and he did that by winning in 36 states. But the point that I want to begin with is that in the first 17 Trump victories, there was actually a bigger anti-Trump vote than a pro-Trump vote. Now that sounds paradoxical, but there's no contradiction, because although Trump was getting less than 50% of the vote in his first 17 victories, he was facing multiple opponents. He was facing Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and John Kasich, and that meant that the anti-Trump vote was split among multiple candidates. It's quite plausible, I mean, we can't prove this for sure, but it's quite plausible to assert that if the anti-Trump forces had coalesced around a single candidate, then Trump might well have lost those elections. And in fact, we have some polls evidence to suggest this. On March 8th of 2016, there were several polls, one by ABC, one by the Washington Post, suggesting that both Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio would defeat Trump in a one-on-one race. But of course, it wasn't a one-on-one race. Both Cruz and Rubio were running, and so they split the vote between them. And John Kasich was another major candidate who was splitting votes with the anti-Trump candidates. Now, the same thing actually happens in many other countries too, and let me briefly mention the experience in France. France has a different voting system from ours. We use plurality rule, as Vince mentioned. In France, they have a runoff system for president. And in 2017, which was the most recent election, there were two candidates in the runoff. Emmanuel Macron, who, as you know, ended up winning, and Marine Le Pen, who is a candidate from the far right of the political spectrum. Now, in the runoff, Macron easily won, but we might worry that nevertheless, the runoff was not a fair representation of what French voters really wanted, because, again, based on polls, there was a third candidate, François Fillon, another centrist, who, according to these polls, would have easily defeated Le Pen had he made it into the runoff. But he was eliminated in the first round because the the centrist vote was split between Macron and Fillon, and Macron got most of it. So from the standpoint of what voters really wanted, it should have been Fillon, not Le Pen, in the runoff. Fillon was much more popular than Le Pen. So what do these examples, the Trump example and the French example, show? Well, US elections, as we've been saying, use what's called plurality rule, or first past the post, as the election method. So each voter votes for one candidate. The winner is the candidate with the most votes, even if that's short of a majority. And as we saw from the 2016 Republican primaries, plurality rule is highly vulnerable to vote splitting. That is, if there are two or more similar candidates, say anti-Trump candidates, who split the vote, that allows a very different sort of candidate to win, even if that very different candidate is not really as popular as the one whose vote is split. Now, France and Russia and Brazil and Romania use runoff voting for their presidential elections. So each voter votes for one candidate. If there's some candidate who gets a majority of the vote, then that candidate wins in the first round. But what normally happens is there's a second round where the two candidates who get the most first round votes face each other. And then whichever gets a majority there wins. As we saw in 2017, runoff voting is also vulnerable to vote splitting. And so the natural question that these examples prompt is, can we do better than this? Is there a better way to elect presidents? I'm going to argue that the answer to that question is yes, but of course, when we use a moral term like better, we have to define what we mean by better. And so a lot of this talk is going to be focused on what do we mean by better. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that the two examples that we've been looking at suggest that when voters are simply voting for a single candidate, they are not really providing enough information about their preferences to get a democratic outcome. So in the Republican primaries, Rubio or Kasich might well have defeated Trump head-to-head, but there's no way of taking this into account in the voting system itself, because that information is not collected if voters are simply voting for one candidate, Rubio or Kasich. They can't vote for both. Fillon, as I was saying, was almost certainly more popular than Le Pen, but again, there was no way that people who didn't vote for Fillon could show that they preferred Fillon to Le Pen. So the first part of the solution is to have voters provide more information than just their favorite candidate. They should have the option of ranking candidates. So instead of just voting for Rubio, you might say, well, I like Rubio the best, but if Rubio doesn't win, then I want Kasich, and then perhaps after that Trump, or I might have the ranking Trump, Kasich, Rubio. So that's part of the solution. But then the question is, well, once we've collected these rankings from voters, how do we determine the winner? And what I'll be arguing today is that we can turn to the great political theorist and engineer Condorcet, who was active in the late 18th century in France, for the answer to that question, because Condorcet proposed what we might call true majority rule as an election method. How does that work? Well, voters submit rankings, and then on the basis of those rankings, we elect the candidate who would beat each other candidate in a head-to-head contest. That would be the true majority winner. The winner beats every other candidate by a majority. So here's an example. So suppose that there are three groups of voters. There are the Trump supporters, 40% of the population, the Rubio supporters, and the Kasich supporters. And I've indicated the proportion of the population corresponding to each. But voters are now doing more than just indicating their favorite candidate. They're providing a ranking. So the Trump voters like Trump best, then Kasich, then Rubio, and so on for the other two groups. Well, who is the majority winner here? I'm going to argue that it's Kasich, because Kasich, in a head-to-head contest with Trump, beats Trump. These voters prefer Kasich to Trump. That's 35%. And these voters prefer Kasich to Trump. That's another 25%. So 60% of the electorate prefers Kasich to Trump. But Kasich also beats Rubio, because these voters prefer Kasich to Rubio. That's 40%. And these voters do too. Kasich is preferred to Rubio by an additional 25%. That's 65% for Kasich over Rubio. So Kasich is the true majority winner. But you would never be able to tell that if voters were just voting for one candidate. In fact, Kasich does the worst according to a voting system where you can only vote for one candidate. Now, what would happen under our current system, plurality rule? Well, Trump wins because 40% is bigger than 35 or 25%. And what would happen if we use the French system, which is runoff voting? Well, remember, in runoff voting, in the first round, you vote for one of the candidates, and then the two candidates who get the most votes go on to the runoff. Notice Kasich gets eliminated in the first round because Kasich gets only 25%. It's Trump and Rubio who go on to the runoff. In the runoff, Rubio wins because these people prefer Rubio to Trump, and so do these. So that's 60% for Rubio. But although that's a more democratic outcome than the plurality rule outcome, it's still not as democratic as true majority rule. Okay, so I've been showing you true majority rule as a way of determining the winner. But once voters are submitting rankings, there are many systems besides true majority rule that we could use. And the question is, why not use one of those instead? For example, many of you might have heard of ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is a ranking method in which voters submit their rankings, and if there's some candidate who is ranked first by a majority, then that candidate wins. But if no candidate gets a majority, then we drop the candidate who is ranked first least often, And that candidate's supporters have their second choices move up into first place. Actually, let me correct that. That should say first place, not second place. And then we see if somebody now has a majority. If no one has a majority in that second round, then we keep going. We keep dropping candidates, moving their supporters' second place choices into first. We keep going until someone does have a majority. This is a voting rule which is catching on in the US. It was recently adopted by Alaska for congressional and presidential elections. It was a few years ago adopted by the state of Maine. It was on the ballot in Massachusetts in 2020. It was defeated narrowly, but it's being considered in lots of places. And it's certainly better than plurality rule because voters get to express themselves more fully than plurality rule. But I'm going to try to show you quite systematically that it is not as good as majority rule. Now, again, I have to say what I mean by not as good. Let me skip over that. The way that a voting theorist like me tries to define what a better method is by first stepping back and asking, well, what is it? What are the ethical principles that we want a good voting rule to satisfy? And then after we've specified what those principles are, what those ethical requirements are, then we can go back to the concrete voting rules themselves and see which ones satisfy these principles and which don't. So what are the principles that I'm going to put forward? Some of them are very obvious. They almost require no discussion. I think the consensus principle falls into this category. What the consensus principle says is that if all voters agree that candidate A is better than B, then we shouldn't elect B. It would be a very perverse system which elected B even though everybody thinks A is better. Economists, as usual, have different terminology. They call this the Pareto principle. And economists will know why. Now, this is such an obvious principle that it's clearly satisfied by true majority rule and ranked choice voting. The next principle is also, I think, almost self-evident. It's the idea that all voters should count equally. It's an equal treatment principle. It could also be called the anonymity principle for a reason that I'll explain in a moment. But equal treatment means that in taking two different voters' votes, we weight those votes the same. It doesn't matter who you are. That's the anonymity part. It just matters what your vote is. So we don't weight some people's votes more than others. Again, it's very hard to quarrel with this principle, but interestingly, it does happen to be violated by the Electoral College method for electing presidents because, according to the Electoral College, it does matter what state you're voting in. Depending on which state you are, your weight will be voted more or less than people in other states. But I'm going to leave aside the Electoral College today. True majority rule and ranked choice voting both satisfy the equal treatment principle, the anonymity principle. The next principle is called neutrality. And all it says is that just as we should treat all voters equally, we should treat all candidates equally. That is, we shouldn't give any candidate a special lift just because, for example, they happen to be the incumbent. We don't want to give incumbents special treatment. We treat them the same as any other candidate. That's neutrality. And once again, true majority rule, ranked choice voting satisfy this principle as well. So far, we haven't come across a principle that distinguishes between ranked choice voting and majority rule. But in my introductory remarks, we said that vote splitting is a problematic issue when it comes to voting. We want to avoid a voting system which is vulnerable to vote splitting, because if we're, say, deciding whether candidate A or candidate B wins the election, it shouldn't matter whether some third candidate, candidate C, is running or not. This is sometimes called the independence of irrelevant candidates. If candidate C has no chance of winning himself, it shouldn't matter if he's on the ballot or not when it comes to deciding between two serious candidates, A and B. Now, true majority rule satisfies this no vote splitting principle. And it's easy to see why. If there are three candidates, A, B, and C, candidate A is the winner if a majority of voters prefer A to B, and also a majority prefers A to C. But notice it doesn't actually matter whether C is running or not for A to be the winner. If C is not running, well, A still gets a majority against B, and so majority rule is not affected by irrelevant candidates. But rank order voting does violate the no vote splitting principle, and let's see why. And let's use this same example, the Trump-Rubio-Kasich example I was talking about before. Suppose we have a ranked choice voting election where voters rank the candidates. Notice that nobody gets a majority, and so what we do is eliminate or drop the candidate who gets the fewest first place votes. That's Kasich. And now Kasich supporters' second choice, Rubio, moves up into first. And now Rubio is going to beat Trump because these voters prefer Rubio to Trump, and these voters prefer Rubio to Trump, and they rank Rubio first now that Kasich has been eliminated 60% of the time, 35% plus 25%. So Rubio wins a ranked choice voting election. But suppose that Trump never ran, that Trump decided not to stand for election. Then it would be Rubio against Kasich. And notice that Kasich wins in that election because 40% of these voters, these voters who constitute 40% prefer Kasich to Rubio, And these voters do too. So 65% of voters prefer Kasich to Rubio. Kasich wins if Trump doesn't run. So ranked choice voting violates the no vote splitting principle. Well, now we see that majority rule pulls ahead of ranked choice voting. But the story's not quite over yet, because I haven't mentioned all of the ethical principles yet. There's one more. And according to this last principle, majority rule runs into trouble. The last principle says that in every election there should be a clear-cut winner. That isn't always true with majority rule. Here's an example. So I've changed the numbers a bit. It's still Trump, Rubio, and Kasich, but now there are these three groups of voters, the Trump, Rubio, Kasich voters, the Rubio, Kasich, Trump voters, the Kasich, Trump, Rubio voters. Let's try to calculate the majority winner. Well, it can't be Kasich because Rubio beats Kasich. These voters prefer Rubio to Kasich, and these do too. That's 68%. So it can't be Kasich, but it can't be Rubio because Trump beats Rubio. These voters prefer Trump to Rubio, and so do these, and that's 67%. But now it can't be Trump because Kasich beats Trump. These voters prefer Kasich to Trump, and so do these, 65%. So there's no majority winner, which seems paradoxical. If you haven't seen an example like this before, you might be scratching your head. How can this happen? Well, that's the way majority rule works. It does not always produce a clear-cut winner. This example is called a Condorcet cycle. It was discovered actually by Condorcet, the same guy who was promoting majority rule. It's a cycle because we go round and round in circles. Rubio beats Kasich, Trump beats Rubio, Kasich beats Trump, Kasich beats Trump, and then Rubio beats Kasich, and so on. So we go round and round in circles. Since there's not a clear-cut winner, we violate what we might call the decisiveness principle, that there's always a decisive outcome. So majority rule satisfies 4 of our 5 principles: consensus, anonymity, neutrality, no vote splitting, or IIC. Ranked choice voting satisfies 4 out of our 5 principles. Not the same ones. There's an overlap, but they're not identical. Wouldn't it be nice if there were some voting method which satisfied all 5 principles? That's an obvious next question to ask. Let's find a voting method that satisfies all 5 principles. Sadly, the answer is there exists no such thing. This is a mathematical theorem which was discovered about 70 years ago by Kenneth Arrow. In fact, that theorem is called the Arrow impossibility theorem. There is no voting rule that satisfies all 5 principles. Well, that's discouraging, of course. Impossibility usually is. But I'm going to argue that there's a sense in which this theorem paints things too pessimistically. Because Arrow insists that a voting method must work regardless of what voters' rankings turn out to be. And yet, in practice, some rankings may not be very likely, so perhaps we shouldn't worry about them very much. For example, going back to Republicans and Trump, I think it's fair to say that most Republicans either love Trump or hate Trump. There's really no middle ground. Among Trump supporters, Trump is better than any other Republican candidates. Among never-Trumpers, just about any Republican candidate other than Trump is better. So the Republican Party is polarized, and the way to look at that is to imagine that these four rankings are possible, because notice that these four rankings all put Trump at the top or at the bottom. They never put Trump in the middle. These are the two rankings. With three candidates, there are six possible rankings, but two of them involve Trump in the middle. If we get rid of those, or if we deem them to be very unlikely, then majority rule does okay. So let me put it this way. The Republican Party is polarized. That may not be so good for the Republican Party. It may not even be so great for the country, but it's very good for majority rule, because majority rule will be decisive if these two rankings rarely occur. The example that I showed you before, the Condorcet cycle, can only occur when one of these two rankings occurs quite often. So that suggests that we should be a little bit more modest in what we require. Rather than requiring all five properties to hold all the time, we'll say that a voting method is considered to work well if it satisfies the five properties for some limited class of rankings. We'll say that the voting method works well for this class if it satisfies the five properties when voters' rankings are limited to that class. So, for example, if voters' rankings are limited to this class of four, then majority rule satisfies all five properties. It works well. The only problematic property was decisiveness, but it will satisfy decisiveness on this restricted class. And now we come to the precise sense in which I'd like to argue that majority rule is better than the others. And again, this takes the form of a mathematical theorem, which I obtained with an old friend and collaborator of mine, Partha Dasgupta, who's a professor of economics at Cambridge University. And this is what the theorem says. Take any voting method you like. Suppose that voting method works well for some particular class of rankings. When I say it works well, it satisfies the five properties when rankings are drawn from this limited class. Well, then it must be the case that majority rule also works well for that class. And furthermore, there will be some other class of rankings where majority rule works well, and the other voting rule does not. In other words, majority rule works well more often than any other method. If another method works well, majority rule must also work well in those same circumstances, and furthermore, there will be other circumstances where majority rule works well and the voting rule we started with does not. So majority rule dominates any other voting rule. That's the sense in which we can define better and best. Now, there's one small problem, which is that if we adopted majority rule, it's conceivable, it's not very likely, but it's conceivable that it wouldn't be decisive, that we might fall back on Condorcet's example. In practice, that doesn't happen, but we have to be prepared just in case it does. We need some kind of tiebreaker. But one way of breaking the tie might be to use ranked choice voting. In fact, it actually doesn't matter what we use as the tiebreaker because it's going to be applied in practice almost never. Now, one last question. I've shown you a theoretical case for a majority rule. Might we expect this ever to be adopted? And there I see some cause for optimism. One interesting feature about the United States, as opposed to many other countries, is that the decision about what voting rule to use is not decided at the national level. It's up to each state what to do. In fact, it's written in the Constitution that each state legislature can decide how that state's electoral college votes are allocated. We don't need a federal law. We don't need to change the Constitution. So that means that the example that has already been set by Maine and Alaska can be followed by other states. And in fact, there are quite a number of other states. Interestingly, Utah is one of them. Minnesota is another. There are quite a number of other states who are actively looking into switching to ranked choice voting. And once states have switched to ranked choice voting, it's actually a small step to go from that to majority rule. I'm not going to get into it, but it turns out that a very small change in the rules moves you from a ranked choice winner to a majority winner. Now, as for France, well, there's a lot of discussion going on there, too, about voting reform. This was prompted by Marie Le Pen doing so well in 2017. Voters were perplexed. How could such an extremist candidate get so far in the French election? And the answer, of course, is that France uses a suboptimal voting system, runoff voting. So there's plenty of possible reform going on. I'm confident that 10 years from now, our own country will be well on its way to ranked choice voting and beyond, the beyond being majority rule. And on that note of optimism, let me stop and open the floor to discussion. Thanks very much.
I'm going to use some microphones. If you'll just secretary use microphones so our audience can hear out loud.
Sure. Okay. So, yeah, okay, so, Tom, are you willing to direct traffic here?
So simply so that our audience can hear, if you would ask questions from the microphone, our audience online.
So, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my first question is, as we saw in 2016, there was 10 Republican candidates. for
16, actually.
Yes, 10 were on like major debate stages.
Yeah.
And in the 2020 election, there was 20. So I feel a little bit uneasy saying that majority of people will rank all 20, or at least know all
Yeah.
20. So I
Very,
feel like,
very good question. So requiring voters to rank 10, 15, 20 candidates is imposing a tremendous burden on them. But the point is that they don't have to do that. The way that the voting laws usually work is that voters are given the option of ranking as many candidates as they want. And in practice, it's usually enough for voters to be ranking just 2 or 3 to get to the majority rule outcome. We know this because ranked choice voting, which, as I've been saying, is similar in many ways to majority rule, has been used for many years in some American cities, such as San Francisco and Minneapolis. And we know, and recently New York City adopted ranked choice voting for its mayor's primary last spring. And we know from the ranking data there that it would have been enough for voters just to rank 2 or 3 candidates to get to the majority rule or ranked choice voting outcome. So it's up, we leave it up to the individual voter. However many they want to rank is fine.
thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm Connor Carney. I'm in the econ department here. And my question was about voter turnout. And if you've thought about that, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yes.
Sort of, that could be a principle that we'd want to
Right.
maximize voter turnout. And is voter turnout actually a function of the rules or the system you have in place?
You're right that a voting system that encourages voter turnout is likely to be a better system. And in American elections where voting is optional, there have been many elections, many presidential elections, where the turnout rate has been barely over 50%, which is pretty disappointing. So there again, we have information from cities where voters have been using ranked choice voting as opposed to plurality rule, the old system, and we can do a before and after comparison. So San Francisco switched to ranked choice voting about 12 years ago, and people have looked at voter turnout rates before, when they were still using plurality rule, right, and after, and indeed, turnout went up. Now, of course, that's not a perfect measure because, of course, voting in any given year is different from voting in a different year. This is not a controlled experiment, but at least based on what we can observe, it seems as though ranked choice voting encourages more turnout, and it's understandable why. Giving voters the option to rank candidates gives them more expression. Voters like to be able to express themselves. If they're given the opportunity to express themselves more fully, that's a greater incentive to vote at all.
Obviously, in the U.S., we don't have a parliamentary system, and it's very hard for third or alternative parties to get a seat at the table. Is there any data that municipalities or countries that institute this type of true majority or ranked choice voting have a development of those third-party systems?
Again, an excellent question. There is one country in the world where we have a huge amount of data on this question, and that's Australia. Australia has been using, again, not majority rule, they've been using ranked choice voting for over 100 years now. And yes, Australia has more than two, well, they have three major parties. So again, it's not surprising that ranking candidates should give third party candidates a better chance. Under the plurality rule system, and in our country where there are just two major parties, if you're a voter and you're thinking of voting for a third party candidate, you're going to think twice, because you know that the two major party candidates are the fallback position. You might think that you're just throwing away your vote if you vote for a third-party candidate. Or worse, if you vote for the third-party candidate, the major party candidate who you like better may now lose. This happens, a famous example where this happened was in the 2000 US presidential election. For those of you who are too young to remember that election, that was an election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And it was a very close election. It came down to one state, the state of Florida. And amazingly, Bush won by fewer than 600 votes in a state of 5 million. But what people sometimes forget is that there were actually several, but there was one especially popular third-party candidate on the ballot named Ralph Nader, who got nearly 100,000 votes in Florida. Now, the people who voted for Ralph Nader never expected that the election between Bush and Gore would be so close. If they had known, they might well have not voted for Nader, but for Gore, because most Nader voters were likely to prefer Gore to Bush. Under a system where you can just vote for one candidate, third-party candidates, well, Nader got 100,000 votes, but when he ran again in 2004, he got far fewer because none of his previous supporters were willing to take that chance again. The advantage of a ranking system is that you can comfortably put your favorite candidate, even if that's a third-party candidate, on top, and then put one of the major party candidates, the one that you prefer, second. So if your candidate doesn't happen to win, you've got a backup. That's what happens in Australia. And that's why Australia is able to sustain more than just two major parties.
Thank you.
My name is Max Hendricks. I'm a junior here at Holy Cross. So talking about that first example that you gave in which Kasich wins, in that situation, Kasich is only 25% of the population's favorite.
Yep.
And so I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about maybe why you don't think that's a problem, or why you think that it's because the way that I see it is that this is then incentivizing choosing a candidate who is like okay. They're okay for everyone, right? As opposed to a candidate who is very, very gripping for one side, maybe not for others. So, for example, like Donald Trump was very, very gripping to some people, and that's why he won under this system. But for Kasich, for example, wasn't very gripping to that for many people, but people were like, oh, I guess I'd be okay if he's president. And so I was wondering if you think there is any problem there, and if there is, what would we do about it?
Well, again, an excellent question. You're asking about intensity of preference. I think there are two ways to try to answer that. First, it's not altogether clear that just because a voter ranks a particular candidate first means that she thinks that that candidate is way better than every other. It may be that the difference between the first and second place is pretty small. You can't tell that just from the rankings. So the first answer is there's nothing magical about being the first place candidate for some voter, because it may be the case that the second place candidate is pretty much just as good. But that brings up the idea of, well, could we go farther in empowering voters and allow them not just to rank candidates, but to indicate their strength of preference? For example, we could give a candidate 10 points, and she could distribute those 10 points among the candidates in any way she saw fit. Would that be a way of capturing voters' preferences, intensity of preferences? Unfortunately, that system is not likely to work very well. And here's why. Suppose there are just two candidates, candidate A and candidate B. And suppose that I, as a voter, happen to like candidate A a little bit better than B. Under this point system, I might give, if I were really voting according to my strength of preference, intensity of preference, I might give candidate A 6 points and candidate B 4 points, because I have a total of 10. Or I might make it 5.5 to 4.5. But if I got into the voting booth, that's probably not what I would do. Because after all, I do like candidate A more than B, maybe only by a little, but I do like candidate A more. So what I'm probably going to do is to give 10 points to candidate A and 0 to B. Why wouldn't I do that? In fact, we know from places where such systems have attempted to be implemented that people tend to exaggerate their intensities to get their favorite candidate elected. So you're right that it's possible that when we take into account not just first place votes, but second place votes and third place votes, that might be a recipe for electing an okay but not thrilling candidates. But the problem is that there is no possible voting system which can effectively distinguish between okay and thrilling. If we tried to incorporate intensity, we would run into the exaggeration problem. But it's a very good question.
Thank you.
Hello, and welcome back.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time and the effort that you put into this research and talk. Listen, I'm curious, the ballot initiative in Massachusetts that failed in ranked choice voting, I'm sure, like me, it was pretty disappointing for you.
It was.
What's your sense of why these ideas weren't able to be communicated to the public? When this was happening, I tried to read about maybe what the other side was, and it was some mix of fear of uncertainty and my belief that this isn't what the founding fathers, something like that. So I'm curious, this will probably come up again, and maybe if more adopt it, we'll get on board. But anyway.
My experience. So let me say again that although today I was talking about majority rule, I think ranked choice voting is already getting us a good long way in the direction of majority rule. So I'm very much in favor of initiatives such as the one in Massachusetts for getting ranked choice voting adopted. It's my experience from the Massachusetts campaign and other campaigns where I've worked, including New York, where it was successful, that if voters really understand the advantages of ranked choice voting, very few are opposed. New York did a very good job of educating the public on what on what's at stake with ranked choice voting and why voters should embrace it. And in the referendum that was used to adopt ranked choice voting, over 75% of voters endorsed it. So ranked choice voting is a matter of education. If voters understand it, they like it. If they haven't got that education, they might say, well, why do something like that? It's more complicated. I like the old system, without realizing what the old system delivers time and time again. Now, I'm afraid that what happened in Massachusetts is the initiative got going. They were planning to rely on the tried and true education methods, meeting people in malls, having town hall discussions, and then there was a pandemic. And so none of that education got done. They still tried doing stuff online, but it didn't really work. And so in the end, a very large fraction of Massachusetts voters just didn't understand why it was such a good idea. As you say, it's bound to be tried again. And it did work in Alaska, it did work in Maine. I think it's going to happen in Utah fairly soon. So once these other states start adopting it, I think we'll see a groundswell of enthusiasm. But education is essential.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Ramses. I'm a senior here. And I was wondering if you could speak a little in the sense of the electoral college system, which you touched on before. So in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, you co-wrote this article in which you speak about sort of the, quote, insurmountable barriers that it would percent for the U.S. to actually change this system, and including the need for like 3/4 of the states to actually support this,
Yeah.
right? So what are some things that you think would need to happen for this to be possible, especially bringing into the equation something that you mentioned, the national popular vote interstate
Compact, yeah.
There we go.
Okay, right.
Bringing something like that into the equation.
Yeah.
What would be the need for it? Thank you.
It's a very well-educated audience that knows about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Okay, so as you point out, changing the Constitution to get rid of the Electoral College really does seem insurmountable, in particular because 3/4 of the states would have to sign on. And why should a state which is already getting weighted much more heavily by virtue of the current system give up its power? It wouldn't be in their self-interest to do that. But there is an alternative, which is the Interstate Compact. Maybe others of you have heard of this. This is an agreement among states whereby a state that belongs to the compact will award its electoral college votes not to the winner in that state, but to the national winner, the national popular vote winner. And the compact will take effect when enough states have joined so that their total electoral college votes add up to more than 270. 270 is a majority. Now, where are we now? I think we're at something like 195, so not too far away. That is, states whose electoral college votes add up to 195, maybe it's 192, have already signed, including Massachusetts. Now, why haven't the rest signed yet? Because the two most recent elections in which there was a discrepancy between the popular vote and the electoral college vote both favored Republicans. Bush won in 2000, even though Gore had a popular majority, and Trump won in 2016, even though Clinton had a popular majority. So Republicans think that the compact is a democratic ploy. And in a sense, it is. Well, it was inspired by these discrepancies. And in fact, every state that has passed the compact so far has been a blue state, with one exception. I think Colorado is actually a purple state. So, but what Republicans forget is that over time, a change like this is not going to favor one party or another. And in fact, almost inevitably, there's going to be an election, probably within our lifetime, or at least your lifetime, where a Republican wins the popular vote and yet loses the electoral college vote and therefore loses the election. And when that happens, then the interstate compact will finally pass. So we just have to wait for that to happen. And it will. I can't say exactly when, but I think there are even odds that within 20 years, 5 election cycles it will happen. So that's at least a small degree of optimism. If we went the constitutional route, I think we're out of luck. But thank you for bringing it up.
Hi, I'm Teddy Christensen. I'm a freshman at Holy Cross, and I just have a quick question for you. Is there any benefit to either party, Republican or Democrat, to use plurality instead of rank voting or majority voting? And if so, is this a factor in its existence today?
I'm glad you asked. Ranked choice voting or majority voting are nonpartisan. That is, there is no particular advantage that one party gets over the other by going to a ranking system. However, and this comes back to a question that was asked a little while ago, third-party candidates have a better chance under a ranking system than under plurality rule, because under a ranking system, people who like third-party candidates don't think that they're throwing away their vote to rank those candidates highly, whereas under plurality rule, they're afraid to vote for a third-party candidate. So both parties have expressed resistance to ranked choice voting. In fact, the Massachusetts legislature refused to take the bill up. The only way it was going to get through in Massachusetts is through a popular initiative, a ballot initiative, not through the legislature, because people have Republican and Democratic politicians have a vested interest in keeping the status quo. I think they're wrong about what's good for democracy, but they know what's good for them.
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Maskin. My name is Alex Kirchgesser. I'm a senior here at the college, and I had a question on Australia. So they've been using ranked choice voting for over a century now.
That's right.
Have they ever made that small step to go to the majority rule voting? If so, what's preventing it?
So they have not. And I think the reason is actually a technological one. You see, to do majority rule requires more elaborate vote counting than either plurality rule or ranked choice voting. With ranked choice voting, with plurality rule, you just have to count up which candidate gets the most votes. That can be done by hand, and it was done by hand a century ago. Ranked choice voting involves a little bit more, but it could still be done by hand, and it was done by hand a century ago. Majority rule involves comparing each candidate with every other candidate. You have to look at every possible pair. If there are only 2 candidates, that's an easy job, but if there are, say, 8 candidates, as there often can be, or 16 candidates, or 20 candidates, then doing that by hand is not on the cards. But it's very easy for a fast computer to do it. It can be done almost instantly by a fast computer. So I think majority rule, now that we have fast computers for vote counting, will start to be adopted in various places around the world, including, I expect, Australia. But because those fast computers have only been available relatively recently, there wasn't an opportunity to make that shift in a big election like Australia or the US until quite recently.
Thank you.
You mentioned neutrality of candidates as one of the pieces of a good voting system.
Right.
I was wondering if you saw, campaign funding and the necessity of financial prowess to be a good candidate, a roadblock to that neutrality, and how might ranked choice voting or majority rule kind of address that issue?
So that's a tough one. It's a very good question. It is very hard in our political world for a candidate to get known to the voting public without a lot of spending, primarily in the form of advertising. And this is one way, of course, in which incumbents have an advantage, because they're already known to the public. They were elected once already, at least once already. So the system, as it stands, is slanted in favor of incumbents. And ranked choice voting or majority rule doesn't help in that respect. Something that could help, and there have been attempts to do this kind of thing, is campaign finance reform, where, for example, donors to political campaigns are limited in how much they can give, or perhaps best of all, campaigns are entirely publicly financed. So there's a pot of money that is acquired, say, through taxes, and then it's divvied up equally to all serious candidates, candidates who pass some threshold in, say, petitions. That's the kind of reform I would favor. In the US, it faces a pretty tough roadblock, and that is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, at least as currently constituted, has viewed campaign donations as free speech, as a form of speech, and because of the First Amendment, they've been reluctant to enforce laws that put limits on how much people can give. I personally think that's a misinterpretation of what free speech means. I don't think free speech should translate into dollars, but until that view changes, I think putting all candidates on an equal footing is going to be tough in the United States.
Hi, my name is
Hi.
Olivia Shamlifer. I'm a senior at the Holy Cross. So you just spoke about how increased polarization is good for the true majority, but it's
I'm sorry, what is good?
the increased polarization
Oh,
allows
yeah.
it to work better.
Right.
Sorry. But then following that logic, it seems like under this true majority system, an increasing number of centrist or moderate candidates would be elected, which then following that, the polarization would decrease, which I feel like would lead back to the original issue of that concert cycle. So I don't know how you would address that issue.
Oh, okay. So a very good question, because it allows me to say something I didn't have a chance to say in my talk. So it is true that a polarized electorate is good for majority rule in the sense that if the electorate is polarized, then there will be a decisive majority. However, polarization is not the only way to get majority rule to be decisive. Another way is for voters to care that candidates are close to them ideologically. So imagine that there's a spectrum of ideological belief going from the left to the right, and each voter lies somewhere along that spectrum according to her own political beliefs. Well, she's going to tend to prefer candidates who are closer to her position than farther away. Suppose that that's the way that voters rank candidates, according to how close the candidate is to what they themselves believe. Well, then, majority rule will be decisive. That's another case where majority rule will be decisive. And so you were worried about the polarization of the electorate, but never fear. All that it takes for majority rule to be decisive is that voters care about the ideological positions of the candidates, and if they do that, if they vote accordingly, then majority rule will be decisive, and furthermore, the winner will be a centrist. And it's very easy to see that the winner will have to be a centrist because only a centrist could get a majority against every other candidate. So your question points to another advantage of majority rule, which is that it promotes moderation. At least I view that, particularly in the current political environment, as a plus to get candidates elected who appeal to a majority and are therefore moderates.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I have to bring the conversation to an end. I'm grateful to the students who asked some really great questions, and to my colleagues as well, but I'm particularly grateful to you, Eric, because it's one of the clearest ways of setting out a structural flaw built in deeply into our system and seeing systemic inequalities and structural inequalities when we talk about those. And then you did something really magical. You said that despite that, you're still optimistic. So you passed along some hope, and I haven't heard those two together in a long time. So anyway, please extend a hand of applause. I could say, too, that you're an economist who didn't want to monetize. Free speech is another surprise. Let me take your mic. Thank you. That was great.
That was a lot of fun. Very, very good questions. So.
Thanks. And we'll go up in a few minutes. I do want to get a picture of you and Vince and maybe some students together.